The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden from Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, the big story this week was in Ghana, where the conviction of a Chinese national by the name of Aisha Huang, who's become a truly notorious figure over the past few years, simply dominated the headlines. Huang was engaged in what's called Galamsey mining, which is the kind of illegal mining in Ghana that is absolutely ravaging large parts of the country. In fact, the situation has gotten so bad in many parts of Ghana that waterways have become so toxic and polluted that there's real concern big parts of the country are actually running out of potable water. Now, Huang was first arrested back in 2018. The Attorney General back then filed charges against her and then decided that it would be better to simply deport her back to China. So for a few years, she dropped off the radar and then mysteriously kind of popped up again last October when she tried to sneak back into the country using a different name and identity, but it did not work, and she was quickly apprehended. This time, though, the Attorney General wasn't having anything to do with deportation, and he wasn't going to let her off, and they took her to court and to trial. Now, on Monday, the court rendered a verdict against Huang. Let's take a listen now to how the news broke on the national TV network Joy News.
High Court Judge in Accra has jailed Galamsey Queen, Aisha Huang, for 4.5 years, plus a 48,000 cedis fine. Aisha Huang was jailed on 4 counts of engaging in illegal mining, illegally employing foreigners to engage in Galamsey, among others. Delivering a judgment, Justice Lydia Osei-Mafo noted that stringent efforts must be made to prosecute chiefs and farmers who give out land to illegal miners to help the fight against the Galamsey. Let's take a look at how this case, if you look at it, and Huang was accused of being in the thick of affairs of Galamsey, especially in the Ashanti region in 2017. She was deported from the country in 2018 after the AG decided to discontinue her trial, in which she was accused of engaging in small-scale mining without license. She was said to have sneaked back into the country to engage in the same activities for which she was deported.
Now, that 48,000 cedi fine is about $4,000 US. And for the first few hours of the news coverage on Monday, the Ghanaian media focused most of its attention on Huang, as we just heard on Joy News. But by the next day, on Tuesday, a very different tone began to emerge in the discussion. The narrative on talk radio, on newspapers, on television, and even on social media moved from Huang to comments by Presiding Justice Lydia Osei-Mafo of the High Court of Accra, who, as you heard in the Joy News report, mentioned specifically in her verdict where she called out chiefs and landlords for allowing illegal mining to take place on their property. This set into motion a whole discussion about how Huang is more a symptom of the problem rather than the cause. Let's listen now to what Elvis Darko, who's the editor of Finder newspaper in Ghana, had to say about it when he appeared on City TV's nationally broadcast breakfast show.
I'll commend the judge. Part of the ruling of what she said is that no foreigner can come to Ghana to come and do Galamsey without the collaboration of the Ghanaians.
Yeah.
And so she's of the view that whilst we are chasing the Galamseyers, the law should also go after the landowners and chiefs who give their lands to people to do illegal mining. And I think that some of us have said this thing so many times that, look, if the one who is giving the land will go scot-free, nothing will happen to the person, then the Galamsey fight will be difficult. But if it's part of the law that when somebody is undertaking illegal mining on your land, you, the landowner, you face prosecution. So I think that the recommendations of the judge that the law should go after the owners of the land. I think that it is one very important thing that if we want to win the fight against Galamsey, we must include in the law.
But the public outcry following the Huang verdict didn't stop there with the landowners. A lot of people said the landowners aren't the only culprits here, and that's why they want to focus attention on the people in power who are profiting from the kind of illegal mining that Huang engaged in for so many years. The hosts of the morning show on 3FM 92.7 radio in Accra were very clear on who they think is responsible.
How do you motivate people to protect what is supposed to be for all of us, which is kept in trust by the President of the Republic, whose assigns have been found to be culprit in what's going on? How do we go about it?
It's a big security concern. There are parts of Ghana where Galamsey is going on, it's rife, and the forestry can't even go and combat it because they go there and they are met with people with guns and all types of weapons. At this point, I think Galamsey is rather fighting us. We are not fighting Galamsey.
And another important point I observe is that everything is vested in the president, the Lands Commission, Minerals Commission, and all the individuals who serve on those commissions largely are appointed by the president. And if you look at the scheme of things, a lot of the politicians are also involved in this illegal mining. So the politicians cannot fight against themselves. You know what I mean? Because if there's an issue and somebody has a license, it will come from Mineral Commission or Land Commission, whatever commission. And these are the politicians who get those licenses. So when they mess up the environment or they do the wrong thing, they go back to their own party people. And that's how we had issues like party Yenska and things. They were having that kind of conversation.
Cobus, this is a very different type of discussion that's been taking place this week in Ghana than what we heard back in 2018, 2017, even 2014 or 15. You and I started the show in the early 2010s, and we were talking about this. And back then, all the focus was on the Chinese, foreigners. Now Ghanaians are saying, we can't fix this problem until we hold our leaders accountable for what they're doing.
Yes, I mean, this is an interesting turn. I mean, maybe a pretty obvious point, I think, but still, kind of like good to acknowledge it publicly. All of the research we've featured over the years, not only in relation to Galamsey, but also in relation to illegal logging, for example, in many African countries, particularly in Central Africa, have shown that local officials are central to these kind of illegal trade. And I think then the question becomes more about how to combat the practice rather than how to manage it in some kind of way where there's actually an economic benefit from it without ruining the environment. Kind of striking that balance seems to be not really even in the conversation at the moment, and that is also an interesting detail for me.
Well, let's dive into that question of that balance between accountability, the environment, and again, who's responsible here. And we have a fantastic guest back on the show again. We had him on last year at the same time to almost talk about the same issues about Ghanaian illegal mining. Francis Xavier Tuokuu is a Ghanaian scholar who's done extensive research on illegal mining. He's also done fieldwork throughout West Africa to investigate environmental compliance and safety trends in the region. And he's a research fellow at the Afro-Sino Center of International Relations in Accra, but joins us today on the line once again from Washington, D.C. Francis, a very good morning to you and welcome back to the show.
Good morning, Eric and Cobus. I'm a fan of your podcast, so I feel privileged and honored to be back on your show.
The honor is all ours, and we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about these dramatic events that have been taking place in Accra. The verdict came down on Monday from the Accra High Court. Let's start with what your reaction was. She got 4 years and 6 months. Now, she was tried under the old illegal mining law, which the maximum sentence was 5 years. The new mining law is 15-year minimum with a 25-year maximum. The Attorney General now says he wants to potentially retry her on appeal to qualify under that stiffer laws. The reason why she wasn't charged or sentenced under those more stiffer laws was because she committed crimes in 2015 and 2017 before the law came into effect. Give us your reaction to the verdict and the discussion that's been taking place all week in Ghana about illegal mining.
For me, I had mixed feelings, reaction to the sentencing of Aisha Huang, in the sense that the sentencing is very lenient. 4.5 years, she will be out, to continue to enjoy her wealth, the wealth that she acquired from Ghana. And also, we lost the fight against Galamsey the very first time Aisha Huang was deported in 2018. But the positive side is that at least she's been sentenced, and it will serve as a deterrent to those who are engaged in Galamsey mining, especially foreigners. However, I thought that the Attorney General's office would have tested the new law. The new law should have been tested for me. Laws are meant to be...
But they said they couldn't test it because the crimes were not committed during the time the new law was in effect. That was what the Attorney General's office said.
So why is he going to appeal?
It's a very good question. Why, if it wasn't true before, why it's going to be true on appeal, I don't know. But that was the rationale for charging her under the old law.
Exactly. So laws are meant to be tested. So for me, the new law should have been tested. If the new law was not tested, why is he appealing? You see, but we are starting somewhere. Starting somewhere in the sense that, like I said, it will serve as a deterrent to foreigners who come to Ghana to engage in illegal mining. Because the law says that small-scale mining is reserved for indigenous Ghanaians. So foreigners are not supposed to engage in small-scale mining. So that's what I will say for now.
So maybe right off the bat, for people who haven't really been following this so much, can you kind of give us an idea of actually what Galamsey is and how it works? The image that people have that are not from Africa, I think, like our idea of small scale or artisanal mining is something like from the 19th century, people panning gold in rivers, for example. So, kind of how do people actually get to the gold, and like what kind of processes are involved in refining or basic refining the gold, getting it out of the ore? And, for example, what level of machinery is involved? And so on.
So before the PNDC law of 1989 was enacted, the activities of miners in Ghana went on in many parts of the country without any central coordination and regulation. So in 1989, the PNDC law was enacted to kind of give indigenous Ghanaian mining rights to mine. So what it means is that small-scale artisanal mining has a formalized process. There's a formalized process for small-scale artisanal mining, and it's divided into two. Those who are operating legally are referred to as small-scale miners, but those who are operating illegally, the Galamsey miners. Now, about 35% of Ghana's gold come from the sector, accounting for 60% of the mining labor force in Ghana. So the sector is dominated by people who don't have any formal training, who don't use any equipment. Equipment here means people who don't use heavy machineries like the large-scale miners do. They use simple tools, rudimentary tools, to mine for gold. However, over the years, with the penetration of Chinese miners and other foreigners, they have introduced heavy machineries, and they just clear the bare lands with impunity. And because foreigners, especially the Chinese, have the resources, they have the money, they tend to provide or make these tools or equipment accessible to locals to mine. But before that, the locals were using simple tools, pickaxes, cutlasses, hoes. Those were the simple tools they were using to mine for gold. But with the presence of foreigners like the Chinese, like I said, they are now using heavy machineries. So it's now even difficult to distinguish between what machineries Galamseyers are using and what the large-scale miners are also using. And they also use mercury. While the large-scale miners use cyanide to separate the gold from the ore, the small-scale miners or artisanal miners use mercury.
And that mercury is what's polluting so much of the waterways, correct?
Exactly. The mercury is what is polluting most of our river bodies. And about 1 million people are engaged in small-scale artisanal mining in Ghana. And out of this number, 85% are operating illegally. Despite the fact that the sector is contributing negatively to environmental degradation, polluting our water bodies, the sector has this potential to contribute to national development if developed well, if formalized and the miners given the right tools and monitored. The sector has the potential to contribute to national development because 1/3 of Ghana's gold comes from the small-scale mining sector.
So President Nana Akufo-Addo has in many ways staked his presidency and the credibility of his presidency on his ability to bring the Galamsey issue under control. He's launched 2 waves of joint military task forces to go into the countryside and presumably to crack down on Galamsey. I think the public opinion and the media commentary on the success of those has been that it's been a failure. It hasn't worked that well because what's been happening apparently is that before the military gets into those regions to arrest the illegal miners, they're gone. In fact, they've abandoned the equipment and nobody's there. And then they just end up picking, people who are not the bosses and whatnot. So I guess my question for you is, we've talked about foreign miners. Aisha Huang is Chinese. The word Galamsey oftentimes is associated with the Chinese. And early on in the early 2010s, the focus was predominantly on the Chinese. But when we look at the raids that do occur, it's not the Chinese that are being arrested. It's a lot of Beninese, Nigerians, and others from West Africa who are being arrested. Can you help us put into context the role that the Chinese play compared to other foreigners in the Galamsey illegal mining sector in Ghana?
Before I answer that, let me talk briefly about, the president putting his presidency on the line. But for me, the president has failed to deal with Galamsey issues in Ghana. A few days ago, he said, in the first place, he believes Aisha Huang was not deported. And for me, this has national security implications. It means the president is not briefed on what is happening in Ghana. But the president said a few days ago that he doesn't believe that she was deported in the first place. Yeah, the president said that in a few days.
We all knew she was deported. I mean, it was public knowledge that she was deported.
Yeah, that's what the president thinks. And for me, it has national security implications because the president should know what has happened in the past 24 hours and what is likely going to happen in the next 24 hours. So if he's telling us that he thinks Aisha Huang was not deported in the first place, it means he doesn't know what is happening in Ghana. And for me, that's a failure. Now to your question, yes, there are other nationals besides the Chinese who are involved in Galamsey mining in Ghana. Ivorians, Beninese, Nigerians, Burkinabes, etc. However, the Chinese are dominating the conversation because they have the resources, they have the capital. And mining involves a huge amount of capital. And so the Chinese, they have the money, so they bring the money to the country and give that to the locals to mine. So sometimes the Chinese are not directly involved in the mining, or they don't do the mining themselves. So what they do is that they give the money to the locals to mine and then bring the gold and then they get their percentage. But in some cases, however, the Chinese themselves are involved in the mining, and which is illegal.
And can you give us an idea of roughly how many Chinese are involved, or what percentage of all of the people working in Galamsey would be Chinese?
So I'll just give you a rough estimate. So for instance, between 2008 and 2012, there are about 50,000 Chinese involved in artisanal small-scale mining. That is illegal mining. That's between 2008 and 2012. And the number has increased more than that. So roughly, about 500,000 Chinese are involved in the small-scale mining business. In 2018, about 4,000 nationals were deported from Ghana for engaging in artisanal small-scale mining. I mean, different nationals. Out of this number, there are about 700 Chinese who were deported.
That's a high number. And Cobus, let's put this into the context of some of the other conversations that we've had about Ghana in the past few years. When we talk about illegal fishing, the Chinese are central actors in that. We've also talked with NGO experts and researchers about illegal logging in Ghana as well, and the Chinese are central actors there as well. And so with FOCAC coming up, it's interesting that African governments like Ghana are not putting more pressure on the Chinese government to try and crack down on what their nationals are doing in places like Ghana. And we had the same situation of illegal mining in the eastern DRC and also in parts of Nigeria as well. So this is not an issue that is confined to just Ghana alone. But Cobus, does it surprise you at all that over the years there's been no mitigation of the presence of Chinese illegal miners, logging, and fishing that's been going on in West Africa?
Yes and no. Like, on the one hand, yes, because if they wanted to control this problem, it would be a relatively easy problem to contain, because according to other research that I've read, many of these Galamsey miners come from like a handful of districts in China, and a lot of them have strong community ties. So in theory, it would be relatively easy to find them and to control them before they leave, particularly. I think the interesting kind of corrective example in all of this is ivory, right? Kind of because for a long time, ivory poaching and the flow of ivory from Africa to China was a very toxic political issue. It remains a big problem, but it's gotten a lot better thanks to legislation in China and concerted crackdowns in China. What we've seen with logging, for example, is that the Chinese authorities simply throw it back to the African authorities. We recently covered a big new report about illegal logging and, wood flowing from places like the Republic of Congo to China. And there, Chinese authorities were basically saying we're dependent on the Congolese authorities. If they don't raise an official complaint, then we can't do anything, which of course is nonsense. There's lots of things the Chinese can do. Like if one just looks at the very strict regulation of local logging within China, that's a completely different issue than international logging. So there's clearly kind of a lack of political will on both sides, which makes me wonder what the kind of flows of money up the ladder is, because usually it's a follow the money situation. If there's a massive problem and no African official seems very exercised by it, then there's usually that kind of reason. But I mean, maybe I'm just stereotyping.
But Cobus, that question of political will is really important because here in Southeast Asia, what we've been seeing is how the Chinese have been going around country to round up thousands of Chinese nationals who are committing telecom fraud back into China from these different countries. And the coordination that they have with local law enforcement to grab these people is remarkable. And I think it just goes to show that there is a pathway for the Chinese to use. In the case, here in Southeast Asia, it's telecom fraud and cyber crimes, but in Africa it could be environmental crimes. But they could work with local law enforcement as aggressively as what they're doing here in Southeast Asia to go grab these illegal miners in partnership with Ghanaian law enforcement. I don't see that happening, but it just goes to show that where there's a political will, there's a political way. And coming down to this question about political will, at the end of the day, as we heard on the media commentary, the buck stops with the president and with the government. And I know, Cobus knows what's going on, okay? The people on the radio know what's going on, and I think the average guy on the street in Accra also knows what's going on. Why hasn't anything been done to stop the illegal fishing, logging, and the Galamsey mining? Is it just corruption? Is it just money?
Yeah, corruption is part of it. You remember when Aisha Huang was first arrested in 2018, a senior minister at the time, Yao Asafumafo, some of us advocated that Aisha Huang should be tried, but she was rather deported. And the senior minister at the time said we didn't have to try her because of diplomatic relationship between Ghana and China, and that Ghana was seeking for a loan from China. If we deport Aisha Huang, there was going to be that kind of diplomatic role. And so for me, that was a failure. That was where we got it all wrong. And so she was deported. So there's lack of political will in the enforcement of our laws. In my research work, what I've found is that the problem is not the lack of policies, but the inability or lack of capacity to implement the existing policies.
Is it capacity or is it will? I mean, is there really a lack of capacity? Because here's the reason I asked that question. Sorry to interrupt you, but the Ghanaian government fined a Chinese trawler $1 million for illegally fishing off its waters and without a permit, okay? The Chinese trawler did not pay the fine, just ignored it, and went back to fishing illegally without any consequence from the fisheries ministry. What is that?
Yeah, so the lack of capacity also has to do with lack of political will. So they go hand in hand. And lack of political will here also means that some corrupt government officials are getting money from these Chinese illegal trawlers and illegal miners. And some government officials are complicit because they are deeply involved in the process and they benefit from it. And so that has been the problem. For me, I always say for countries in the global south, particularly those in Africa, to make progress in terms of development, we need to eschew from greed. We need to eschew from corruption. And most of our leaders are very greedy. They are corrupt. And that's why we are not making substantial progress, even upon all our mineral wealth, upon all our natural resources. So it has to do with corruption and lack of political will to enforce the laws to the letter and spirit of the Constitution.
I mean, I guess another issue is that any kind of desirable commodity that's illegal immediately creates a kind of an underground economy, kind of a mafia-style underground economy. I mean, cocaine being the great example. In some of your papers, you advocate for a different approach, saying that in the first place that the Galamsey industry as a whole is actually quite a large employer and that it actually also provides, as a kind of like knock-on kind of employment, kind of in these communities, and that there's actually options options to formalize it in some kind of way or to regulate it in a way that actually would make it less destructive? Like, can you talk us through like some of your ideas about how you think Galamsey should be treated?
Yes, so Galamsey, if it is formalized, has the potential to contribute to national development. Like I said earlier, in spite of all the challenges within the sector still contributes 1/3 of Ghana's goals. And, some people are involved in Galamsey because it's largely a poverty issue. Others argue that people are involved in Galamsey mining because they want to get rich quick. But for me, largely, people are involved in Galamsey mining because of poverty. It's a livelihood issue. And there are bureaucratic bottlenecks involved in the registration process. And so some people think that because of the registration bottlenecks, instead of registering, why don't I just operate? Because they believe they have birthright to the ownership of lands. And because they have birthright to the ownership of the land, they can just mine gold and other resources without following the due process. So we have to ensure that the registration process becomes less cumbersome for more people to register. Another is that the top-down nature of formalization is a contributory factor. By the top-down nature, I mean there's lack of decentralized centers for registering artisanal small-scale mining. So if you are in one part of the country and you want to register a small-scale mining, you have to go to Accra to do that. So because of this process, people feel that why will I have to go to Accra, look for accommodation, bribe even government officials or people who are involved in the registration process to register my artisanal small-scale mine. So they just mine with impunity without following the due process. So we need to formalize the artisanal small-scale mining sector to make it easier for Ghanaian nationals to register and operate. Government has attempted to do that, but the formalization process has a narrow focus. We tend to look at it from the legal framework, that is licensing and tracking of miners and securing revenue for government, rather than looking at it from the livelihoods or poverty lens. So we have to look at it from the livelihood lens and poverty lens and make it easier and accessible for miners to register and operate. That way, we can easily monitor them. We can easily monitor their activities. We can easily control their activities. Without that, if we are not able to do that, then we'll continue to experience what we are experiencing today. That is, polluting our rivers with impunity, destroying our lands and water bodies. So that's my take.
And what do you think the chances are of your proposal actually becoming a reality in the current political environment?
It's to have a national dialogue. Some attempts have been made, but usually the Galamsey miners are not involved in the dialogue. My experience has taught me that when people come together to deliberate on issues that affect them, it leads to ownership of the initiative or the policy or the strategy that is being developed. And once people claim ownership of a policy or initiative, the implementation becomes effective. But usually, the Galamseyers are not involved in the dialogue. They are not involved in the process. They just top government officials and some local chiefs and opinion leaders and other stakeholders meet without involving the Galamseyers themselves. And that will not lead us anywhere. We need to involve Galamseyers, first of all, to understand why they are involved in Galamsey activities and also to understand from the livelihood perspective that many of them are involved in it because of poverty, because they have no source of livelihoods. And once we understand it from that point, then we'll be making progress. Other than that, there's no progress. We won't be making any progress.
You make the point in your research that Galamsey actually accounts for very large percentages of mineral, like the number of minerals kind of like delivered to the market. Galamsey is actually a surprisingly large proportion. And we've seen that similarly with artisanal cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo as well. There's a surprising amount of the world cobalt is actually produced in these very kind of like low-tech kind of ways. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the gold supply chain, like who buys from the Galamsey? And, is there any kind of way of organizing the industry, kind of in addition to setting up ways that makes it easier for them to be licensed and so on? Is there any way of dealing with the gold trading kind of side of the Galamsey industry in a way that would actually get better results?
Yes. So the government set up Precious Minerals Marketing Commission to specifically buy gold from small-scale artisanal miners, right? And like I said, 85% of artisanal small-scale miners are operating illegally. Now, on the one hand, the government says Galamsey activities are illegal, right? And we know they are illegal. However, a government entity still buys gold from Galamsey miners. So if you are stopping Galamsey, why then do you buy gold from Galamsey miners? So what it means is that a body that was set up by the government institution buys gold from both legal operators and illegal operators. Also, chunk of the gold that is purchased from galamseyers or galamsey miners usually are from Chinese buyers and Indian buyers, Chinese and Indian buyers. So we have Indians, if you go to galamsey mining communities, you see Indians and Chinese hovering around, some of them sponsoring their activities and buying the gold from them. They give them the money to mine and then they buy directly from them. So the way forward is to formalize the sector in the first place. And then we can even give them access to credits to mine. And then we monitor their activities. And when they mine the gold, then we buy the Precious Minerals Marketing Commission will then buy from them. Even banks, we can even empower banks to give them money and then buy the gold directly from artisanal miners. That way, we'll be able to sanitize the sector. But if we don't do that and we continue to behave the way we are behaving now, there's no way we are going to end Galamsey. Galamsey will never end if we don't find a way of formalizing the sector. Because some of them operate deep in the forest and there's no way Operation Vanguard or the military can go into, they don't have the equipment and resources to go deep into the forest. Some also mine in the nights. So you see, so the way forward is just to formalize the sector, empower miners and buy the gold directly from them. That way we are creating wealth, we are reducing poverty in mining communities, and we are also developing the economy.
Francis Xavier Tuokuu is a research fellow at the Afro-Signer Center of International Relations in Accra, joining us again on the line from Washington, D.C., one of the sharpest guys out there for understanding all of the dynamics of what's happening in the illegal mining sector in Ghana. And Francis, again, thank you so much for helping to sort all of this out for us. It's been fascinating. We really appreciate your time today and for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much for having me.
Cobus, as Francis was explaining the levels of corruption that pervade so much of the Ghanaian government on this capability of cracking down on this, I was thinking about what's happening in Dubai all week and the COP28 summit, and how there's this demand from developing countries, many in Africa, for the global north to fulfill their pledges to the Loss and Damage Fund. And it brings up this question that if Ghana cannot manage its own fishing, timber, and mining industries today, and doesn't have the capacity to do that, will $100 billion a year in restitution from global north countries who committed most of the environmental crimes over the past century, how will that money be handled by these countries that are clearly struggling to have effective governance on environmental matters?
That's a very good question. It's a very difficult question, I think, to answer. It's easy to be in very un-BC territory once, in this discussion. But I think, there's been a lot of questions about who should be handling that kind of money, including, I think a strong push from global north countries that it should be the World Bank, which is very strongly opposed by many global south countries for a bunch of technical reasons. I think what will probably be needed is for some kind of management architecture to be set up to evade exactly this problem, to evade this kind of a sieve kind of problem where money just leaks away through 1,000 different gaps in the system and doesn't actually get implemented in any kind of useful way. It's a huge challenge, and I don't know that we necessarily have done enough thinking about how to solve that problem.
Cobus, while it's depressing to think about the fact that this probably won't change anytime soon based on what Francis was saying and what we're hearing from the Ghanaian media, it is encouraging, though, to see that Chinese nationals who are violating laws in different African countries, and again, not really to pick on the Chinese here, anybody who's violating laws in African countries are actually doing jail time. So this is the latest in a series of Chinese nationals who've not been just summarily deported as it used to be. But you remember in Rwanda back, I think it was in 2020, a Chinese boss whipped his employee and got a 20-year jail sentence. Then there was the racism for sale individual who was showcased in that BBC documentary. His name by the name of Liu Ke. He was sentenced to jail in Malawi, and Malawi also sentenced a Chinese ivory smuggler to 14 years in jail. And so we're starting to see accountability, at least, for people who are violating those laws. And I think one thing that's very important to mention here is that the Chinese embassy, they've said this over and over again, pleads with their people to abide by the local laws. And people like Aisha Huang are nothing but a pain in the ass for the embassy. So there's nothing here about China and the Chinese. Big difference between the two. That the Chinese embassy and the Chinese government don't have the ability or the will, as we've talked about, to control what some of their nationals are doing. And they find that a lot of these nationals bring ill will and bring bad reputation upon the embassy and the Chinese state as well. So again, it's very important. Some people conflate those two together, and very important to make sure that we distinguish from that. And at the same time, just to see this accountability starting to happen now in different African countries, I think that's a positive trend.
I think so too. And I think African governments, if they were maybe a little bit more knowledgeable about these contradictions, I think they could get a lot done by being a lot more aggressive on these things and actually making it more of a diplomatic scandal, actually. So if Ghana, for example, with the illegal fishing, if they fully impounded the ships, arrested the crew, made a big fuss about it, then that would embarrass China enough to actually probably do something about it, At the moment, I think a lot of people in China are kind of coasting by on assumption that the recipient governments are not going to do anything, really, or not going to make enough of a fuss. But I think they'd be able to get action from China without necessarily getting much negative fallout, I think.
100%. 100%. And what we're seeing in the conflict right now between the Philippines and China is how effective it's been for the Philippines to bring journalists, social media influencers, and to use their own drones to document their side of the story. And so using radical transparency as well to show illegal fishing, illegal logging, and to say you have to do something. And here's the other thing, though, Cobus, that we have to remember, is that in the FOCAC Declaration, copied and pasted year after year, is all about this joint commitment to protect the environment, the blue water economy, all of that. It's summarily ignored, okay? We see it over and over again being ignored with the illegal fishing and illegal logging and all of this that has not abated over the years, as Francis and other experts have been telling us. And I think that's another venue for African governments to say, listen, you have put in writing that you're going to commit to making sure that the African blue economy and African environments are protected, and you're not living up to that. And again, they can do this also in private as well. The Chinese don't always respond very well when they're berated publicly on these things. But I think you're right. Naming and shaming is something that could be very effective. But at the end of the day, as we've heard over and over again, the people who would do the naming and shaming are the same people who are profiting from this. It's what the radio DJs at 3FM were talking about. Are we expecting the leaders to make this appeal when they themselves are putting money in their pockets? I mean, that's not going to happen.
Well, the thing is, is that if one happens to be a corrupt African official, you could make so much more money from a gold economy that's actually running more efficiently and making more money than you could from the current kind of teeny tiny, kind of nickel and dime kind of way that these officials are gathering, extra pay. That's for me always one of the lessons that Africans don't learn from Asia, is that Asia is corrupt. I mean, most economies in Asia have high levels of corruption, including China, but it's a form of corruption that produces a lot and then skims off the top, rather than the kind of corruption that you see in Africa that skims so much that nothing gets produced. And I think one doesn't need to somehow magically root out corruption from the African system. You just need to make the system work better. And in which case, they'll be you will literally enlarge the pie. And then the corrupt, sadly, will also gain from that, but they won't be the only people gaining.
Let's close our discussion today reflecting a little bit back on, again, COP28 in Dubai. You have been following all week what the Chinese have been doing there. Not a lot of headlines coming out of COP28 about the Chinese, a few here and there, but considering the size of their delegation, considering the importance that they have in this global climate discourse, rather subdued presence for the Chinese for the most part. Give us your takeaway on what you saw this week in Dubai and what you didn't see.
Well, just for context, at the moment when we're speaking, some of the issues haven't really been dealt with yet. So what I'm looking out for is how China and India actually will land in the loss and damage conversation. Because, among others, because I think the G7 kind of delegation or the kind of rich global north, they're very interested in trying to kind of cleave the global south off from China and India in their, kind of in their coalitions. So I think they'll probably be leaning into the idea that China should contribute to loss and damage, which has been quite controversial on the Chinese side. What we've seen so far is that China is very much a kind of a mixed bag. And at the moment, it's focusing very much on China's domestic impact, the impact of China's domestic emissions on the global climate scene, which is huge. So it's very much kind of like, oh yes, and oh no, So for example, China has committed to its first real kind of comprehensive methane control agreements, which is a big step forward. However, Chinese CO2 emissions are still huge. Like China and India essentially kept global emissions from decreasing just on their own, just because they emit so much. And what's also really worrying and problematic is that China is now leaning into Saudi Arabia and some of the other petro-states on opposing, clear language on a phase out of fossil fuels and trying to kind of weaken the language. So that's happening against the background of massive, like 4 times as much as last year's kind of representation from fossil fuel companies at COP. So fossil fuel companies themselves now make up a significant percentage of the COP crowd. And they're very actively working to try and kind of weaken language to try and kind of eke out another, 5 years or 10 years of oil profits before it would necessarily have to, be phased out anyway. And China is positioning itself to a certain extent in that coalition. And so that's very problematic and very worrying. But we're still kind of halfway through the COP process, and it's weighted towards the end, because there's all of these fights around whether there'll actually be a final declaration and what will be in that declaration. And so, I think the last half of the COP process is going to be even more contentious than the first half, I think.
Well, we're going to get an update on that from Anika Patel, who is a China analyst at Carbon Brief, and she has been covering the China Pavilion all week in Dubai. She's going to join us next week on our China Global South podcast. So make sure, if you want to get a deep dive into what happened with China at COP28, to join us next week for that. Let's leave our conversation there. We've got a lot of coverage of what happened in Ghana this week up on our site at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. So if you're a subscriber, go and check it out. We're also going to be doing a lot about it next week as well, looking at the reaction and what's next for Aisha Huang. So it's a fascinating story. It speaks to much larger issues in the China-Ghana relationship about environmental management, governance, again, the capacity of both the Chinese embassy and the Ghanaian governments to crack down on this environmental crime that is really just devastating and ravaging so much of the Ghanaian countryside. And so very, very important. Let's leave our conversation there. Cobus and I will be back again next week. But again, if you would like to join our community of readers, please go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. It's free for 30 days and then a very modest subscription fee. And we do appreciate your support for all the work that Cobus and the team are doing. So for Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.